Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Ryan Cooper. This time we've got the second part of our interview with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez advisor Robert Hockett. If you missed the first episode, we'll link it in the description in case you're curious. So without further ado, let's dive right in.
Yeah, I was something very formative for me, and it's sort of surprising that it would have been formative because it was, I was already pretty far along in life, was the occupation of Wall Street back in 2011. So, back in basically from mid-September approximately through mid-November, it's basically the 17th of September through the 17th of November, I was working at the New York Fed at that time. I worked at the New York Fed for quite a while, even while I was teaching, sort of moonlighting. And so Zuccotti Park, as you guys might know, is just a couple of blocks away from the New York Fed. And so what I would do during the entirety of the occupation is I would work by day at the New York Fed, then I'd walk over to the park when I left work, and I would hang out and camp out all night with the occupation as part of it, and as a member of a few committees like the Alternative Banking Committee and the Occupy SEC Committee and others. And then I'd come back in the morning to my apartment down here, downtown, wash up, redress, and go back over to the Fed. And the thing that was totally and utterly and wonderfully amazing about, there are a lot of things that were wonderfully amazing about the occupation in Zuccotti Park, but the coolest thing of all is it really was itself a modeling of what a kind of collective deliberative democracy would look like. And the human microphone that we became kind of famous for was not only a kind of a wonderfully, let's get back to intrinsically versus sort of instrumentally good stuff. It was not only an instrumentally good thing in the sense that it enabled any one person's voice to be amplified over the entire park without having to use electronic microphones. It was also an intrinsic good because I found, at least, because what happened was, as part of the human microphone, you literally had to mouth everybody's words who had something to say to the group, even somebody who was disagreeing with you. If there was a debate going on, you had to repeat what your opponent was saying, and your opponent had to repeat what you were saying. And there was something very beautiful about that. It not only sort of symbolized, but it kind of enacted our being one, our sort of stepping into each other's shoes. And it also had this kind of beautiful, almost liturgical, and there's another Greek word, right? Liturgos, I think. Yeah. There was something even liturgical about it in a kind of call and response sort of way. So there was something really remarkably kind of church-like and liturgical and deeply democratic and deeply sort of identifying with the other, if I can put it in that kind of vaguely literary critic sort of way, deeply identifying with the other about it as well. And as a result, I think all of us who were involved in that movement and who were part of that scene in other cities as well, of course, were just profoundly affected by it and changed by it. I don't think I've been the same person since, even though I was pretty crazy lefty going into it, or I wouldn't have gone into it, I guess. But you know what I mean. Yeah. So one way at least I find it personally kind of fun and helpful and illuminating to think about the Green New Deal is as, in a certain sense, to put in place or to sort of unfold a kind of national counterpart to our so-called General Assembly at Zuccotti Park and in other sort of equivalent places all over the world during the so-called occupation, right? Because during that time, we really were collectively deliberating, even to the point of repeating each other's words in order that everybody could hear everybody's words. And there's never been, I don't think, a better enactment of or symbolization of the idea of, out of many one, and out of one, e pluribus, to go Latin now, e pluribus unum, right? I mean, there really was a kind of a oneness and a manyness at the same time of all of us. We were acting jointly and severally at the same time. It was incredibly beautiful, and I don't see why the country can't do it, and in a certain sense, why the world can't do it.
I love it.
Yeah.
So glad.
That's very beautiful. But I would like to maybe pull this back a little bit, so some more concrete stuff. If you still got some little time.
Oh yeah, all the time in the world, you guys. As much as
wonderful,
as much as you like.
Wonderful.
I love these conversations.
Great, yeah.
They should all be like this.
So, I've been looking into, and some of the stuff I've been writing over the last few months. the issues of hydropower and nuclear power. And so you look at the current U.S. energy power generation portfolio, like about 4,000 terawatt hours per year, and nuclear is about 20% of that. And a lot of a number of nuclear plants over the last few years have been shutting down because they're basically under the current price regime, just not competitive with natural gas. And, these plants are getting on in years. Some of them are past their operational lifespan and they need some expensive maintenance and it just doesn't pay. And on the other hand, there are a lot of dams in this country. There was a Oak Ridge laboratory study I was reading that if you were to put power installations on all the water projects in this country that don't have any power capacity on them now, and then you were to build out theoretical capacity in areas outside of national parks, wilderness areas, and wild and scenic rivers, you could potentially get about 400 terawatt hours, something like that. In conversations with climate focused types, environmentalists, they tend to really not like that type of argument, to say that we should, new nuclear appears to be kind of troubled. Westinghouse went bankrupt because the cost blowed on the plant they try to build in Georgia, I believe. Like the ecological damage from some water projects, Glen Canyon Dam and stuff was really bad. But there's a sense, I think, looking at these immense capacities and the necessity of having to build out lots and lots and lots of zero carbon power as fast as we can, that you really can't overlook these type of options. Do you think that factions of the kind of climate justice community, the folks behind a Green New Deal will have to sort of swallow some of these uncomfortable policies, some subsidies to at least keep the nuclear fleet in operation for the next couple of decades, and maybe build a bunch of new power plants, hydropower plants, just because we can't get by without that power.
Yeah. So, I guess I can't speak for everybody, and it's hard to know precisely maybe, sort of what the numbers or percentages are of people who would be willing to countenance this or willing to countenance that, and sort of under what circumstances. But one thing I feel pretty confident in saying is that as a whole, and maybe even to a person, those who are, sort of gung-ho about the Green New Deal and playing a role in conceiving it and developing it and sort of strategizing about how best to sort of sequence the various parts of it that we sort of elaborate over time. My guess is that all of us who are involved in those capacities are probably pretty much of the following opinion, namely, try to get to completely renewable as quickly as possible, and don't foreclose the prospect that we can. Don't, in other words, assume that we can't, that it's just too much, that it's just too big a bite to sort of chew or whatever. Make a massive effort to get to that point that quickly, but at the same time, don't start, sort of tossing stuff that is currently being used before you've gotten to its replacements. You see what I mean? I think one reason we're probably all agreed to something like that maxim or something like that principle is because, in a sense, you can think of it as a simple corollary to, or a simple entailment, a kind of a theorem derivable from. Oh, there's another Greek word, I think, right? Or theorem. Another theorem, in a sense, derivable from the broaden the menu imperative that we really have in mind here, right? So, in other words, if the idea is to increase optionality, to grow the menu of possibilities really, really quickly, and to render cost-effective various renewable or non-carbon emittive or at least carbon-neutral modalities that are currently not cost-effective, so that then people can voluntarily sort of transfer over to them from what we do now, then it almost would seem to follow, again, as a kind of theorem from that you don't actually eliminate other stuff until people are actually able to do those transitions, right? To make those transitions over to those other menu choices. Another way to say this might be, let's say that you've got a menu. Let's actually use a real menu as a kind of a metaphor instead of just using the word as a kind of a simile, where we imagine as a metaphor, we've got, like, we're in a restaurant. We're a bunch of people. We go to a restaurant, or we always go to the same restaurant, and the menu just has, like, hamburgers and hanger steaks and pork chops on it or something. And then somebody says, well, you know what? This stuff's unhealthy. It's also kind of ethically wrong. It treats animals shabbily. It doesn't recognize their rights. We really ought to move toward a vegan menu. And then somebody says, well, but it takes a bit. We have to find out who's going to supply the vegan stuff, what we're going to have on this menu, what we're actually going to eat, where we're going to get it, who are the reliable suppliers. What we would do, I would think, would be steadily to sort of add these vegan options to the menu and steadily make them more attractive than the other options, so that you would at least start by getting, a lot of people would now suddenly start eating those other options on the menu and would actually migrate away from the unhealthy and unethical stuff. Be that as it may, either way, one thing I'm pretty sure we wouldn't do would be to say, oh, we're just going to take all that meat off the menu. We're just going to have literally nothing on the menu until we come up with vegan stuff, right? So I'm guessing that, probably most of us are on board with the idea of we move as quickly as possible to pure renewable, and that we're perfectly okay with, before we get there, using stuff that we do, but also maybe changing the balance of the portfolio among the things that we already do. For example, if natural gas is cleaner than coal, and some places are in the process of transitioning to natural gas from coal, we say, well, yeah, keep doing that while we develop these other things that don't involve burning stuff at all. I'm thinking that most of us would probably be perfectly on board or cool with that, and not, just saying, let's go and shut everything down at once and ban all flights, as some Republicans have suggested the Green New Deal secretly wants to do.
It's because they think we want people to suffer. They right? They don't. It's like we want them to not have any options they like or something.
Yeah, we're monks, right? We want to wear hair shirts, right? Or we want to join one of those sects where you sort of thrash your back with thistles, so that you bleed. And no, that's not what we're about, right? Well, it's funny. Like, at one moment they'll describe us that way, like we're a bunch of sort of sadomasochistic ascetics, and then
we're hippie free love, right? Like,
we're champagne socialist, or we're sort of sybaritic, kind of corrupt bastards. And it's just, I guess they really ought to try to get their story straight, for one thing. But the problem is, as it currently stands, straight or otherwise, there doesn't seem to be a single element of their story about us that's true, or coherent, right? So I don't know. The thing that cracks me up most about this is that, if you were actually a thoughtful right-winger or a thoughtful capitalist who didn't prejudge the issue but actually looked at it before drawing any sort of provisional conclusions at all, I would think you'd be pretty excited about this, because we're talking about massive government stimulus, which usually benefits capitalists too. Right. I can't think of a massive stimulus this country has ever had that didn't benefit a bunch of capitalists. We're talking about a massive boost to economic growth, which tends to make capitalists prosper as well. We're talking about actually mobilizing the entire society around the rapid growth of new energy forms and new methods of manufacturing, or modalities of manufacturing, and new modalities of providing infrastructure and the like. And that's a lot of money to be made by other people. I talked to some Bloomberg people just a little less than a week ago. They were terrific, but they were asking me, what about Wall Street and the Green New Deal, and what about industry and the Green New Deal? And I raised the usual cautionary notes and so forth. But one thing that emerged in our conversation that I hadn't realized myself, they certainly informed me, was that apparently Wall Street is looking to make, they view sort of the green tech as a potentially $12 trillion industry that they would love to get in on. Now, to my mind, that's sort of good news and bad news, right? I mean, the good news is, boy, even they want to get in on it. That suggests that there's at least some prima facie case to be made for the proposition that this might benefit moneyed people too. The bad news is that it means we're going to have to be extra vigilant about making sure these people don't commandeer it or don't
Well, that's right. That's the key.
Because that's what they will try to do. There's no doubt about that. They'll say, "Oh, we've already got shovel-ready stuff. Why don't you let us do it? We've got a great idea for your little Green New Deal plan." Cha-ching, 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 right? And that'll of course be a completely counter-democratic plan and a completely it'll just run completely contrary to the spirit of the whole thing, So not to mention the letter of the thing, insofar as as the letters develop, right? So we have to be on the lookout for all of that stuff. But the one kernel of good news in there, I guess, the silver lining around that otherwise pretty ominous-looking cloud, is the fact that, well, if Moneybags wants to get in on the act, Moneybags must think that there's gain to be had here, and what that means in turn is that even if we don't make it a kind of gain that can be captured by individuals and put into their own pockets, and then excluding the rest of us from, even if it continues to take the form of, say, positive externalities that aren't capturable in the kind of monetizable sense, then that's what we'll do, right? That's the thing to do. And my own sort of general maxim on things like this is, don't monetize anything unless it actually just is much easier to do it when it's monetized. But if you can do it just as well without monetizing it, then God, don't monetize it, whatever you do.
Well, yeah, because, I mean, the main thing is whether they make money or not, what they want is the control and the power over the decision making, right?
Yeah,
and so that's the thing we can't do. We can promise them that they would benefit, as everyone will, right? From this vision. Mm-hmm. But what we can't do is cede control to private interests who don't care about the common good and the collective.
Yeah, and that reminds me of something else, Alexi. Some people have, and some interviews I've done in the last maybe week and a half or so, some people say, now what about this, benefiting, sort of traditionally excluded communities or traditionally disadvantaged communities or currently, profoundly poverty-stricken communities? Is that really the best way to proceed with the New Deal? Is that prioritizing the kind of social welfare or justice aspects of the Green New Deal over the green aspects of the Green New Deal? And my answer to those questions is always the same, and it seems like it's maybe worth mentioning that answer here even before you ask the question, and that is that I actually think this is another one of these cases where you have this kind of providential convergence, because if you think about it, right, insofar as we are environmentally degraded and infrastructurally backward and economically and productively backward, well, where we are most backward in those particular ways is by definition in the least well-to-do communities and in the most traditionally excluded and unjustly done by communities. And furthermore, it ain't a coincidence that these also happen to be the most polluted and the most filth-filled communities, right?
That's right.
Think of Flint, Michigan, for example. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, that would be like job one for any upgrade of, say, water supply technology. And it's also a primarily African-American neighborhood, and it's not an area, and that's not a coincidence.
Right. No, environmental racism is a new field of study for a reason.
Yeah, for a very good reason, right? And one of the upshots that means is, I have a funny feeling that the three of us probably think of the racism part as the part that's most salient, and therefore we're probably most keen on eliminating the racism first, such that if you had to choose between eliminating the racism and and sort of upgrading technology, we would say eliminate the racism. Kind of like I would prioritize the right to a job over the efficiency benefits that come from a job guarantee. But notwithstanding all of that, as it happens, push doesn't come to shove in these cases. You actually do get better environmental cleanup bang for your buck precisely by first targeting those places that are hardest hit. And that happens to be, at the same time, to help out first those areas that have been traditionally excluded for ethnic reasons or racial reasons. It's just because that's the way history has worked, right? That we've basically, exported or sort of concentrated most of our crap among people who we have cared least about. So, you get massive bang for the buck in sort of starting with these areas, and that's the efficiency reason to start there. But at the same time, for people like you and me who think of the justice part as being even more important than the efficiency part, this is also just the right thing to do. So it's yet another one of these cases, again, I keep using that word providential, but this is another one of those senses, I guess you could say, in which the Green New Deal idea involves this kind of wonderful sort of providential convergence of two distinct, compelling imperatives that happen to converge on exactly the same action plan.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I'd like to let me change gears one more time, at least, sure, on my list of
Ryan is a pseudo mechanic. He likes gears quite a bit, so he wants to attend to all the gears.
I used to be totally into bicycling, so I like gears. I'm ready for you, Ryan.
I guess this isn't quite in the wheelhouse of a Green New Deal, but I was recently reading an article that about someone had done a feasibility study on the possibility of geoengineering, and in its cheapest forms, sort of blasting sulfate aerosols up into the stratosphere or something like that. A quite a small and poor country could probably finance something like this, or even just a single wealthy individual. How do you I guess if you've sort of considered it at all, how do you think about geoengineering possibilities in terms of the international diplomatic arena, or just the Green New Deal policy sort of portfolio?
Yeah, so you've put your finger, Ryan, on a kind of a sort of a fault line, I think, within the environmental movement, but happily not within the Green New Deal movement at this point, right? So, and forgive me if I'm saying anything that you're already very well familiar with, but I'm just sort of a novice at this matter anyway. But my understanding is that there are some very promising looking technologies that you might think of under a broad umbrella of sort of abatement technologies, right? Sort of means of removing bad stuff that we've sort of put out there, whether it be into the air or into the water, even into the ground. And that furthermore, those sorts of technologies or modalities of dealing with environmental problems can furthermore be sort of sub-classified under a somewhat broader heading of a kind of geo or meteoro engineering, right? So that you could actually try to act directly on the environment in ways that kind of counteract or mitigate some of the bad ways that we've already acted on the environment without quite realizing it until kind of late in the game that we had been doing that. And the divide, I think, is basically as follows. There are some who say, yeah, let's push down that line, let's push down that path, because that's a pathway that's promising when it comes to developing ways of undoing the damage that we've done. There are others who say, no, whatever you do, don't do that, because then that's going to lead everybody into a sort of false sense of security that we can just go on and keep, belching filth to bring back the president into
right.
To keep belching filth into the environment. It's sort of roughly analogizable to, you remember when some of the new medications, drugs, and vitamin treatments that were developed in the 90s for AIDS were sort of coming online, there was a kind of ambivalence in the reaction to that too. Some people greeted it as a development that meant, hey, well, we might ultimately be able just to sort of cure AIDS, or at the very least postpone, nasty health consequences indefinitely, and to the point where somebody would have been dying of natural causes anyway. So some said rah, rah. Others said no, because now this is going to make everybody engage in promiscuous sex again and transmit the virus everywhere. And I ultimately don't actually know what the ultimate upshot of that debate was. My impression is that the, sort of safe sex advocacy and modalities continue to be propagated as the cures or treatments continue to be developed, and it's a kind of a, both pushing on both fronts at once sort of thing. Now, given that, right, if I don't know if you can, kind of carry over from that example to this one when it comes to what to do now, I'll just say that it's not immediately clear to me that you can't push along both fronts simultaneously, right? It's not immediately clear to me that you can't have kind of a both and there. So, getting back to maybe Jonathan Chait, for example, would prefer, right, like the abatement strategies, and others would prefer not to do that because they think that will lead to a false sense of security or a kind of complacency, or will distract attention away from something that's more urgent, or sort of divert resources that can be better spent or more cost effectively spent on actually developing the new non-carbon emitting technologies. And I'm not competent to kind of make a final judgment as to which of those arguments, if any, would be right. But I would say that as a general desideratum, it seems to me, sort of beyond cavil, that we ought first to ask whether it is in fact possible to do a kind of a both and strategy here. If it is indeed possible to do both, in other words, if it is not the case that doing one somehow automatically just sort of takes away from the other, either by diverting resources or diverting attention or leading to a false sense of security. If it's not the case that happens, then go both and devote some effort as part of this deliberation process that we've been talking about, that the Green New Deal will basically involve, and indeed in a certain sense be, as part of that process, do actually think about it and actually study it and actually try to figure out, who's right on that score, right? Who's right as between those who say no, we can do both and without it's taking away from either term of the conjunction, or is it those people who say you have to do one or the other because doing both does take away from one term of the disjunction, So that would be what I would think, at least at this stage, And again, it might be that within a year or 2 years or 5 years, we realize, oh, you know what, it really was a bad idea to think in terms of geoengineering. It's not very effective, and it takes resources away from what would be much more effective, namely the more rapid development of carbon neutral technologies. Or it leads to that false sense of security or complacency, so that it leads to more pollution, more than we can actually keep up with the abatement technologies. Or it has side effects that nobody had ever contemplated before, like, it's actually turning the world into an easy bake oven or something, or it's destroying entire species or something, right? Or, kind of like some people say you have to worry about GMOs because you don't know what kind of weird genetic upshots might result. I mean, I get that line of worry, and it could be that some such worry could be raised here too, but I just don't know enough about the technology in question to have formed even a provisional opinion about, I don't know, whatever dangers might attend to their promise. I do know that the promise looks remarkable. What I don't know is, of course, whether there's anything seriously counteractive in relation to that promise.
Cool. Yeah. Let's see. I've got one more question here.
Sure.
Maybe Alexi has some more after this, but I want to return to the kind of the political dynamics.
Sure.
And the question of, big fossil fuel, business. Because I went ahead and looked up just now, the fate of coal companies over the last few years. And, I think for any reasonably intelligent, far-sighted business analyst, you could have said in like 2003 that coal is on its way out. And especially once fracking got going and you started getting lots and lots of cheap natural gas, then you think, boy, coal is, these coal companies ought to start making some moves if they want to preserve themselves as a going concern. Most of them didn't do that. And this in October last year, Mission Coal went bankrupt, and that was the fifth coal company bankruptcy in 3 years. These companies just they instead of realistically considering their real position in the as the economy develops and as the market for power developed, and trying to anticipate that and counteract, preserve themselves, they doubled down, they stuck their heads in the sand, they engaged in a lot of denial and funding of, climate change denier, pseudo think tanks and such. It seems to me quite likely that oil companies will do the same thing, that they already have huge assets on their books which are leases for big fields. Some of them are even in the Arctic now that you can actually drill in the Arctic because the ice is so far retreated, and that suggests to me that there's just going to have to be this sort of existential struggle over that the oil companies will not try to transition and just like submit themselves to a zero energy economy, that instead they'll just try to keep the gravy train flowing as long as possible, and what we'll have to do is just basically like whack them down into the ground. Do you think folks should be ready for that possibility?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we should be ready for the possibility. I don't think we should. This sort of re-implicates this observation I made earlier that kind of in connection with what our international posture ought to be, to the effect that we ought to sort of assume the best of people or entities until shown otherwise. What we ought to do, I think, for whatever that's worth, is to sort of assume that these are people who are acting, or at least capable of acting with goodwill or in good faith, and to assume that they're capable of recognizing their rational self-interest, and to assume that they will sort of move into doing the right or sensible thing as long as it doesn't involve an actual threat to their very lives or existences, and make policy on that ground while being prepared for it possibly to emerge that in fact they're just evil, right? or that they're stupid, right? Or that they don't recognize their own rational self-interest, or both, right? Of course, Socrates would say that's the same thing, right? Right? Evil is just a form of ignorance, which it might indeed be. I tend to be Socratic in some ways and Aristotelian in others, but either way, we should be prepared. It seems to be for that possibility without committing ourselves to its truth until we actually know its truth. Now, what does that mean in more concrete terms? I think it means a number of things, right? One is, as new technologies and new, again, sort of more carbon neutral or environmentally friendly modalities are developed, we should be inviting these firms into investing in them and getting in on them at the front end, not with controlling positions, but at least as stakeholders, as sort of partial stakeholders, right, who stand to profit by these developments, even if they don't stand to control them, which means, again, not letting them have controlling or majority stakes in these things, but having stakes that can be profitable. At the same time, the tax code already allows for write-offs on asset losses or even just deteriorating assets, right? And, one way of thinking of a bunch of petroleum fields that are underground that some company has the leasing rights to, or actually one way to think of those leasing rights more directly, in a world where that particular energy form or source is becoming obsolete is simply as a deteriorating asset, right? It's a lease is a legal claim. It's a right. It's a kind of financial asset, and it's simply a deteriorating asset when the world basically passes by the technology in question. And the kind of if we were truly a market-based society, I mean, if the right-wingers who are always talking about the magic of the market were serious about this, what they would say is, well, screw them, let them die then, man, because they made some bad investments. They should have depleted, they should have used those assets up before they depreciated rather than just letting them kind of lie fallow and depreciate. But in fact, we don't, that's what they should say. That's not, of course, what they do say. It's also not what we do as a society. I mean, our tax code provides all kinds of favors to, or consolation prizes, you might say, to firms that lose money, that borrow money, whose assets deteriorate or decline, lose value. So there's also that, right? It won't be a complete and total loss. They'll get to write it off. And if, again, we do a good enough job of making clear to them at the front end, far enough in advance, what the writing on the wall really is, where this is all going to go, and how they have a golden opportunity to get in on it at the ground floor by making investments in it, even though we're not going to let them control it. It seems to me that, most of them will probably play ball, right? Just if for no other reason than that their shareholders only win under that circumstance. And if they don't do it, well, they're not only, of course, going to be presiding over the sort of liquidations of their companies, but they're also, of course, going to face all sorts of shareholder suits against them for violating their fiduciary duties in failing, even so much as to act on what was clearly the thing to do as far as future prospects were concerned. I don't want to get too wonky on you guys as an enterprise organizational law professor, but
no, wonky as you like, wonky as you like.
Some nitpicker will say, well, no, shareholders couldn't sue them for that because it's a business judgment, and the business judgment rule insulates them from any suits of that kind. Blah 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 blah. But if that's partly true, but it's not true when decisions are truly egregious, and if you can show,
yes, you can pierce the veil, right?
Well, this wouldn't be a case of piercing the veil. This would be a case where you actually have shareholders who would be able to bring the cause of action. They would have a cause of action. They would be able to bring a suit, either a derivative suit or a direct suit or both. If, again, the actions of the executives was so egregious as to amount to a form of recklessness rather than mere sort of bad judgment. Right. And it seems to me that we can make the Green New Deal so, and hence the transition to renewable energy sources, we can make this so obviously and dramatically the right thing to do pecuniarily as well as environmentally and justicely, that it could only be deemed an act of consummate recklessness for any executive of a petroleum company not to have made some strategic investments in the particular industries that we're planning to develop and promote. And I don't think they want to risk that. I wouldn't think that these executives would want to risk that. But even if they do, then they'll, their shareholders will milk them, and the companies will go down, and they'll simply be replaced by companies that are actually not destroying the environment, just as readily as dinosaurs were replaced by mammals. That's another, of course, trading on another metaphor that these market types like. They seem to love evolutionary metaphors. Well, all right, dinosaurs, consider the Green New Deal a kind of, you can consider the Green New Deal a meteor shower of sorts, and you have the option of either, growing feathers and becoming birds, or growing fur and becoming mammals, which you have it within your power to do, or you can sink in the La Brea tar pits. I mean, the choice is yours.
That's right.
You're going down with that tar, another petrochemical or petro product, as I understand it. So.
Yeah,
I love it. It's so empowering to see that we finally are taking control of dictating to those powerful corporations and executives, right? That they need to come in line with our goals, or they'll face extinction. That's a beautiful, empowering political vision right there.
Yeah, it's such a wonderful moment. It's almost like one way I sort of think of the sort of revelations that came first through the Occupy movement, which revealed that we actually do care about equality in this country, then by the kind of runaway bestseller status that Thomas Piketty's book enjoyed in 2014, a book about inequality, which you previously hadn't been allowed to talk about without being accused of engaging in class war. Just the fact that that became a bestseller. Then, of course, the phenomenon that was Bernie's candidacy, which, again, I joined basically because I just thought it was a good cause and it would get some good issues on the table, but we almost won that thing. And now, of course, with Alexandria's victory and with the remarkable midterm election more generally, those results in the House, and just everything that's been happening. First of all, there's a sort of accelerating pace at which these indicators are coming along. But secondly, what's being indicated, it seems to me, it makes me think that it's almost like every one of us was individually and isolatedly thinking a particular set of thoughts and thinking that he or she was the only one, and thus not daring to stick his head or her head up above the parapet, right? And then a few of us kind of looked up, and we looked around. We saw, oh my God, there's another set of eyes who's from a head that's poked itself up above the parapet, and you're looking around, and you suddenly see all these heads kind of looking up over the trenches, and then all of a sudden we start yelling backwards to the other people in our own trenches, saying, "Hey, there are other heads up here! Hey, everybody, heads up!" And all of a sudden it's over the top. All of a sudden we're out, and we realize that each of us is realizing that he or she wasn't actually alone or insane in thinking these thoughts. And nor was he or she alone in wanting to do something. And that's just enormously collectively energizing and empowering because, the only thing, what this means is the only thing that was standing in our way, we realized was a kind of ignorance, an ignorance about the fact that there were lots of other people like us. And not only that, but that they, or rather we, are the overwhelming majority. I mean, the numbers, right? George Mason University is not what I would call a left-leaning entity, right? I mean, it's like basically University of Chicago wannabe. It's sort of like, ground zero for reactionary political, quote-unquote, think tanks and stuff. And yet, they, in conjunction with Yale University a week and a half or two ago, conducted a poll about, what are American attitudes toward a Green New Deal. And it was something like 92% of Democrats and something like 64% of Republicans, meaning something like 80 some odd percent of Americans. Now, that's pretty amazing, right? That even Republicans actually want this. But of course, Mitch McConnell's not going to tell them that because he doesn't give a flying, about most Republicans. If you're talking about individual Americans who identify with that party, he doesn't care about them. Neither does Donald Trump. Neither do any of those ridiculous oligarchs who are in the Republican caucus of the Senate. I mean, these are not representing anybody. They're not even representing Republicans. So, and it's clear when you read this polling data, right, that if 82% of the country favors the Green New Deal, including 60 some odd, maybe 64% of self-identified Republicans, why isn't this happening already?
Well, yeah, and that's but beyond that, I think you're hitting on something very, very important insofar as one, ideologically, people aren't so situated in rigid ideological stations, right? They just want their lives to be better, and that's why right. So there's that. People are very movable. And the other thing is that people's will and what they want is not often reflected in the actual legislation.
That's right.
So it's quite empowering to have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who, because she's not taking money from the donor class, is able to say, no, I'm here for the people. And I think I know what they want, but I'm going to listen to them. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to lie to them. I'm going to try to do what they want. And the more that we do that, the more that what gets enacted will reflect the interests and the desires of the people. And that's a thing that can happen.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think, one way to think about our sort of strange political arrangements, which are partly rooted in the Constitution and partly rooted in just sort of corrupt practices that have been developed as sort of customs by one or another legislative body, is as this kind of enormous sort of filtering device that basically launders people's preferences by the time they reach, actual decision makers. And the laundering is so thorough and complete that, basically what the leaders often do, what the leaders do is very often completely unrecognizable as a relative to any actual preferences that people have. One of those, sort of filtering devices is just the bloody Senate itself, where, it's literally the case that if you are a South Dakotan or a North Dakotan, you as one single person from one of the Dakotas have the same power in the Senate as literally 40,000 Californians, which is completely absurd. And, I get it, in order to get the Constitution ratified, you had to kind of placate these states that had these ridiculous conceptions of themselves as being nation states rather than former colonies. Plus, of course, it was, southern states in particular, which were slave states back then, were particularly keen on that. I get that. But, those particular reasons for the Senate either are no longer present or should not be present, right? And sort of similarly with, gerrymandering, the gerrymandering that seems to occur almost routinely now when it comes to congressional districting means that even the House functions as a filtering device in this way. It's not as dramatic or as starkly filtering as the Senate is, but it still is thus filtering. And then, another device, and this is, I think, just partly a matter of jurisprudence, sort of really bad Supreme Court decisions, but it's also partly a matter of really stupid practices, is the very fact that we conduct political campaigns over paid media means, of course, that everybody has to get money in order to run, and then that means in turn that they have to, basically, not be too unfriendly to people who have money. And that's not what a deliberative democracy is supposed to be or how it's supposed to work. What we really ought to have, in my view, is there ought to be, basically the public should reclaim the airwaves and all of the other infrastructures over which media is conducted during election seasons. And it should reclaim them and make of them a kind of public square in the interest of its own self-government. This polity is all about self-governance. And it simply cannot engage in self-government without the infrastructure of speaking and deliberating. And the infrastructure of speaking and deliberating at Zuccotti Park was just a nice big flight of stairs in a sort of amphitheater-shaped space. But if you're talking about a polity or a democracy or a demos that is 340 million people covering a continent, rather than, some 5,000 people in a little park down right off of Wall Street, the technology of collective deliberation is rather more technical, right? And involves various media. And I don't see why we have to, the thing is, everybody seems to understand this in theory that, that the public owns all that stuff and we lease it out to media companies, right? So Fox News doesn't own the megahertz that it occupies; it leases them, and right. And
Robert, do you know how many young people don't realize that we used to have channels that were public that you just press it and you didn't need to subscribe to cable TV? You could just watch channels.
You could just watch so many. Yeah,
they didn't know. They didn't know that was a public good. They didn't understand. They're shocked.
And there used to be this thing until about 30 years ago, and until 1988, there was you know about this thing, the fairness doctrine that the FCC maintained, which was to the effect that if some private media company offered time, including sold time, to somebody advocating some political position, they had to give equal time to some contrary position, right? It was just understood that in a democracy where self-government is a guiding or an actuating ideal, indeed a foundational ideal, that the whole thing was supposed to be about self-government in the first place. Even the Declaration of Independence effectively says as much, right? That in such a polity, you have to have some, again, modality over which the deliberating happens. Just like in order for us to think, you've got to have neurons, right? These brain cells are like the media of our internal thinking process. And likewise, we have media of collective thinking as a polity, collective deliberating. And that includes, megahertz and whatever hertz and cable and satellite and all that stuff. And it's understood that the public owns all of those sort of that ether, as it were, and that it leases it out to various private companies. And the scandal, it's crazy to me. Imagine you owned a building, and then and let's say you had to have access. Let's say you own a building and you leased out various rooms, apartments in the building to various people. And let's say that in one of the apartments was like the fuse box for the entire building. And you had to have access to that fuse box, like in case lights went out or something, you had to be able to get to it. And imagine, so you nevertheless, you lease that apartment to somebody, and then as the owner of the building, you say, oh, I have to get into the apartment right now to get to this fuse box. Can I pay you to get into this thing in order? I don't think you would do that. You would probably say there is an easement, to use legal terms again, from property law. There is an easement that comes with this particular apartment. I will sell it to you for a cheaper price because there is this easement, of course, and it might inconvenience you on those rare occasions when the power goes out in some other apartment. But there is this easement pursuant to which I get to access this fuse box as the owner of this building responsible for enabling power to get to the other apartments or other units in the building. It seems to me it's sort of the same thing, right? We basically lease out these spaces to these media companies. They come with an implicit easement, and that easement is that we have to reclaim them at particular periods for purposes of self-government because this is what we are, a self-governing polity, which makes the capacity to lease this stuff to you companies possible in the first place. Because, if you weren't here in America, you'd be somewhere else where probably the public would actually run the media. And so, I don't think it shouldn't cost anybody who can get a certain, say, threshold number of signatures to show that they're like a serious candidate for something, or that they're advocating a serious position that's not just like a fringe position that 3 people advocate. Anybody who, say, meets some sort of threshold like that should have automatic, unpaid access to the mechanisms of collective self-deliberation. And then what that means is, of course, more views get aired, for one thing, and it means that the people who are representing us are not having to spend literally half of their hours each day, which is, I think, the statistic now, looking for money from people, even after an election, spending half of their hours seeking money from people. And of course, it means that they won't be beholden to those kind of people. I guess I'm just to sort of sum it up. I'm sort of thinking, why do we have to buy what's already ours for the compelling purpose of collective self-government, which is what this polity is, which is the most foundational thing about this polity.
Amen, brother.
Yeah,
amen.
Exactly.
We're undoing this weird inversion. We're just we're trying to put things first,
yeah,
right? Like
exactly.
The collective comes first. All these entities are part of the collective and serve it, but we have to retake that priority and that clearly obvious role that the collective needs to take.
That's the thing. The polity makes them possible, right? That's what they sort of forget. The polity makes them possible. So if anything that you do that undermines the polity or that impedes the capacity of the polity to nourish itself as a going concern, right, as an ongoing organic entity, is ultimately self-subversive as well. It's amazing to me that these people somehow lose sight of that fact, that they're really committing a kind of a slow walking suicide when they try to undermine the very polity that makes them themselves possible.
Reminds me of a classic Onion article, the headline of which is, "American people hire high-powered lobbyists to push interests in Congress."
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And in some cases, it's even worse. It's like Congress hires high-powered lobby to push interests in Congress, right? Because these Congress members themselves oftentimes hate the fact, they resent the fact that they actually have to spend all their time looking for money from media people. I mean, a lot of these people don't really want to have to be asking for money all the time. But the problem is that it seems like no one of them feels like he or she can kind of stop that alone, and they can't seem to get their act together to work together on it. And I'm assuming that has something to do with the fact that the parties who are in power at the moment have sort of, in effect, benefited by the system that we have, even if they resent having to ask for the money. At least it has them on top, right? But my guess is that, and again, this might be a starry-eyed self-delusion too, but my guess is that what happens is when the forces of light retake the Congress and the White House, which I'm convinced is going to happen with the 2020 election, when we retake it, what happens then is we actually have principled people in power. And these people are going to say, look, yeah, we have finally now won, even under the present system. But we also think that was just dumb luck and that the present system is ridiculous and that it has to be changed. So they will then push for change. And now the bad faith actors, the Republicans, will be willing to sign on as well because they'll realize that it's possible for them to lose under the present arrangements. So in other words,
Right.
the Republicans only care about winning and losing. But once they lose, that means they'll be willing to change it. The Democrats, I think, care about winning and losing, but they also are much more principled and care about getting it right. Not all of them, but most. I think a lot of them.
That's right. Not all of them. And Robert, I want to ask you not to so answer this however you see fit, because you've worked with everyone you've mentioned. I think are very principled. There are Democrats that are very. I don't want to say what their motives are or if it's just ideological, but their neoliberalism shines through in a way that seems to cut against some of the egalitarian principles we've discussed. And there does seem to be this split within the party. So it doesn't seem to be just the Republicans we need to be wary about, but also some Democrats that want to perhaps co-opt the Green New Deal or Medicare for All, and then change it to serve capital. That is something I think it's almost as important to be vigilant about, don't you think?
I do. I think it's very important to be vigilant about that. I do think, however, that there's here's a theory I sort of have, or at least a conjecture, let's call it, that I think bears on the form that caution here should take. So let's partition the class of Democratic legislators in House and the Senate. Let's say
Sure.
into three classes, or maybe we'll say two classes, but one of the classes then has two subclasses. So the first class is just those who just really are principled, the folk we've mainly been alluding to this evening. So, AOC on the House side, Ro Khanna on the House side, quite a few others, of course, on the House side. People like Liz Warren and Bernie Sanders, although, again, not exclusively them on the Senate side,
Yep.
Sherrod Brown and so forth. So that's the first class. Let's ignore them for the moment. Let's assume that those guys are going to do the right thing pretty much irrespective of cost or whatever, of political consequence. The remaining class then would be those who are a little bit more instrumentalist, let's say. They're not necessarily completely unprincipled, but instrumentalism is a more important determinant of what they do than it is of what other people in that first class do, people like Bernie and Liz and Alexandria. Okay, so within that class, and so within this class, let's partition them into those who are kind of willing to be compromising or a little bit more Republican-looking, basically because they think they have to, in order not to be voted out of office or in order not to lose, or maybe because they think that the public is actually more to the right than it actually is, that they've underestimated the progressivism of the American public, or they've underestimated the degree to which we actually do care about inequality, because Republicans did such a good job of concealing that fact for so long. Let's say you've got those, the people who are they're still principled, but they're also pragmatic in a possibly misguided way on the basis of, say, false premises. And then the final third group, which would be like the second subclass of this second class, would be those who just basically are neoliberals in sort of justice people's clothing, right? That they're basically just, they're just Republicans who have found it expedient to call themselves Democrats in their districts because they win that way. All right. Now, I don't know how many people are in that third class. I like to think it's a pretty small number. In other words, I like to think that that the number of self-identified Democrats who are actually neoliberal on the merits, so to speak, who are actually good faith believers in neoliberal ideas, is small. I might be wrong about this, but it seems to me that they're probably a significant minority of the Democratic Party. But I don't know exactly how small a minority they might be, but I'm thinking they're fairly small. It's the sort of the first subclass of the second class that I think are maybe most interesting for our purposes. That's to say, those who are as principled as the Bernies and the Liz's, but who are convinced, in my view erroneously, that they have to sort of soft pedal their progressivism in order to win, or in order to get votes, or in order to keep office in their districts or whatever. Here's what I think. I think that particular group, well, it's called Group 2, I think that all of those in Group 2 are going to become dramatically more progressive in the coming months and years as they see that the premises that they believed were false. In other words, as they see that the country is not actually neoliberal in its fundamental orientation, as they see that actually even 64% of Republicans like the Green New Deal idea, as they see that we are actually a center-left country, not even a center country, let alone a center-right country. We're a center-left country at worst, and probably a little, my guess would be a little left even of center-left. As they see that, this doesn't mean that they're, flip-floppers or they're just checking the wind and that they're therefore unprincipled. What it means, I think, is they realize, I was making a pragmatic judgment before. My thought was that, better me than an outright reactionary, but the only way it can be me is if I make a few accommodations to neoliberalism. Right. As they realize that that's just not true, that they don't have to do that, that premise, again, is false, I believe with a great sigh of relief, they're all going to say, oh, thank God, and just become outright, unapologetic, transparently left-leaning lefties again.
God, I hope so.
And they're going to feel clean,
I hope so.
Right? They're going to feel like they went through some kind of detox process.
Yes,
because
they
they're
would.
Going to think, I don't have to be a whore anymore. I don't have to be a strumpet for, this or that interest,
I think Joe Biden is the most sweet strumpet we've ever seen. He's just like he's just the most relatable strumpet there is.
Yeah. And I think, my guess is that his instincts are largely probably still pretty left-leaning, but he has this kind of crazy notion that the only way he wins is if he, rolls up the shirt sleeves and looks like some old sort of hard hat reactionary who beat up Vietnam War protesters in Chicago in 1968. And I think when he realizes that just ain't the case, he probably gets a bit more unapologetically lefty. That being said, I suspect that he's sort of old enough that he might actually hold some actual sort of conservative views from our point of view. And, and so in that sense, I think he's kind of suboptimal. But I would bet you that, for example, Sherrod Brown, who's very, very, I would actually put him in that first camp that I mentioned. I think he's much more principled than just sort of pandering or what have you. But he can't be unmindful of the fact that it's regularly said that the voting public in Ohio and in Pennsylvania and in other purple states it's got some conservatism to it. My guess is that he's going to be thrilled as he learns that actually people are more left-leaning even than we had thought. And my guess is that, even somebody like Claire McCaskill, I'm not, she's for me, she was like the toughest case. I mean, she's not there anymore, but because she lost in November. But the way she talks sometimes, I couldn't tell whether this was just because she knew that there were a bunch of reactionaries whose votes she had to get to, or whether she just was somewhat reactionary. And that's why
whether she internalized that.
Yeah, might have internalized it, or maybe been that way all along. And she's a harder case for me, but I got a pretty funny feeling that the real gut instincts of some of these kind of present-day middle-of-the-roaders like Kirsten Gillibrand is probably a bit more to the left than they've felt safe to admit, maybe even to themselves over the last 20 years. I might be being optimistic in a
I hope so.
Yeah.
I almost feel like the Zuccotti Park utopia is more likely. I really think that there was something to what you were saying, that people that actually engage in these truly democratic ways of coming together in space experience the liberation of that egalitarian way of recognizing other. And I mean, I just remember loving Occupy, like, oh, there's free books. This is amazing. Just
so cool, right?
This is how life should be. Like, what are you talking about? Of course, books should be free. What are you talking? Just like, here you go. Here's a book.
I think people are generally. I think we just have natural tendencies toward reciprocity. Yes. Sure, there are some people who maybe are born sociopaths. Trump might have been born like with a missing gene or something. He might not even be really fully human. It's hard to tell, right, with that guy. But
But
I think most people. I think that seems to me the overwhelming majority of people, kind of respond in kind. So the library that you mentioned over at Zuccotti Park, the cool thing about it is, you could take the books out free. Most people understood that, if you have books to give to it, you should do that too.
Right.
And that was where all those books came from. They were all donated. The reason they were, people get, and then as you'll recall, by the time we reached kind of, maximum Zuccotti, like literally like a couple days before Bloomberg shut us down, we had something like 3, 4, maybe 5 bicycles over on the northern end of the park that were, raised above the floor, so to speak, and had generators attached to them. And people would just voluntarily pedal to generate electricity that would then be stored in batteries that would sort of power the place at night. So, everybody was freely contributing power, literal, like, electrical power to the operation. There were like 3 or 4, tents at I guess it was the southwest corner with red duct tape crosses on them where doctors and nurses volunteered free medical care to people there. And you probably remember, I'm guessing, Alexi, the old ladies who were, they called themselves that, I wouldn't call them, but they identified themselves as the old ladies who like were knitting sweaters and hats for people for when the weather got cold. And then, tons of people like donated food, and Trinity Church and even McDonald's, for God's sake, let people use the restrooms free of charge as a way of sort of an expression of solidarity. A guy from some hugely rich businessman in Seoul, South Korea, phoned up a couple of the local pizza establishments surrounding the park and said, "I want you to feed that entire park tonight. I don't care what it costs. I'll pay you." I mean, there was just this beautiful flowering of just generous, open-hearted giving, right? Oh, and another time, you remember, like, you'd be standing there, and then you'd suddenly be aware of some motion just in the periphery of your vision, and you'd look, and it'd be somebody who had gone over and picked up a broom and was sweeping up some broken glass that she had just sort of seen there. And then she throws it in the garbage, and then she takes the broom back over to one of the broom stations. There were various trees. They would have like a little sign, broom station, and there'd be brooms and dustpans, leaning against it. It was just an unbelievably gorgeous thing, and people just gave willingly because they knew that this is the way it was. You take freely and you give freely, and nobody was like an asshole, like, just taking what they give. And here's the funniest thing of all. This is actually one of the most remarkable, two related things that were most remarkable of all, is like one time, I still remember one evening, like there was a sudden commotion. I heard some kind of yelling or shouting or something. And what it emerged that a couple of pickpockets sort of thought, oh, here's some easy marks, idealistic kids. And they kind of snuck into the park, and they were kind of sidling up to people, acting like they were interested in what was being talked about. And then they would kind of, steal their phones. And finally, somebody realized what was going on and shouted, and then the culprits began to run. And they were immediately apprehended, sort of caught by everybody. But then here's what's cool. Nobody like punched them or beat them up and said, "How dare you, take advantage of us, you mother." Instead, they just basically apprehended them, and they were like, we had like this internal security force of Gulf War and Iraq War veterans who had joined us. They were like the official sort of security force, and they didn't like rough people up or roll them. They just held them firmly, and they took them to the police, who were always around the park, sort of surrounding it, and just handed them over to the police and said, "These guys were, stealing people's phones, officer." And then the officers would arrest them and take them off. And so there's this kind of cooperation even between the cops and the occupiers. And that was the related point I was going to note is that, the occupiers themselves, we would routinely, talk to the police and just say, we just want to thank you for what you're doing. I mean, first of all, you're part of the 99% too. And, last we checked, not a lot of billionaires, sort of volunteer to work in the NYPD. And second of all, we actually just really are grateful to you that you're here. Like, so when we do apprehend pickpockets, we can hand them over to you. And like, people aren't going to take advantage of us and stuff. And I think a lot of that, not all of the cops, but most of the cops, I think, were actually kind of appreciative of that. And they developed a kind of this cute sort of affection toward us. Like, oh, you guys are cute, So, that's just sort of the way it was, I mean, even when, in other words, even when somebody didn't have that reciprocity ethos and just came in to exploit people's kindness or generosity or naivety or, just tendency to expect the best from people, even when that happened, it was all done in a very civilized way by people who were voluntarily acting as security personnel and not just taking advantage of that role as a sort of a nice opportunity to beat people up without having to face repercussions for it,
Well, my hope, Robert, is that the Green New Deal launches 1,000 Zuccotti parks, 100,000 different ways in which the demos collectively initiates things to help each other and move us forward. That people find both cute and profitable, and something worth doing together to save the earth, save each other, and to prosper. So thank you so much. I think you've really outlined a number of ways in which it makes imminent sense, and I think it's a beautiful vision and something we should all be very excited about.
Really gorgeously put, Alexi, and characteristically so. Thanks so much for that, and thank you and Ryan for doing this. It's just been so good to talk to you at length, and again at leisure, without having to kind of get in sound bites and stuff, and
indeed,
get in taglines or whatever. Right? That's
come back on anytime, and we can talk philosophy. Anything you want. We could just right.
Truly, any subject you guys want to talk about. If I'm even remotely competent in it, I would just love to do that. We're sort of modeling this kind of deliberative democracy even right here. This is the way it ought to be, right? One big, long...
This is the good stuff.
Yeah, this is the good stuff. Yeah, this is so great. Thanks so much, you guys. And let's do it again real soon.
Yeah.
Thanks, my friend.
Always game.
Thanks for coming on.
Appreciate it.
You bet, you guys. You bet. Thank you. Talk to you soon.
All right. Talk to you soon.
All right. Bye for now.